In this video, you're going to learn how to handle errors inside of your callback functions, because as you might guess, things don't always go as planned. For example, the current version of the app has a few really big flaws. If I try to fetch weather using node app.js with the A flag for a zip that doesn't exist, like 00000, the program crashes, which is a really big problem. It's going off, it's fetching the data. Eventually that data is going to come back and we get an error. It's trying to fetch properties that don't exist. Body results 0.formatted address is not a real property. And this is a big problem. Our current callback, it expects everything went as planned. It doesn't care about the error object, doesn't look at response codes. It just starts printing the data that it wants. This is the happy path, but in real world Node apps, we have to handle errors as well. Otherwise, the applications are going to become really useless and a user can get super frustrated when things don't seem to be working as expected. In order to do this, we're going to add a set of if-else statements inside of the callback. This is going to let us check certain properties to determine whether or not this call, the one to this URL, should be considered a success or a failure. For example, if the response code is a 404, we might want to consider that a failure, and we're probably going to want to do something other than trying to print the address, latitude, and longitude. If everything went well, though, this is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. There are two types of errors that we're going to worry about right now. That's going to be machine errors, things like being unable to connect to a network. These are usually going to show up in the error object, and then errors coming from the other server, the Google server. This could be something like an invalid address or anything else. In order to get started, let's take a look at what can happen when we pass bad data to the Google API. To view what actually comes back in a call like this, where we have an invalid address, I'm going to head over to the browser and pull up that URL we used in the past. I have it saved right here, and I'm going to go ahead and remove the address we used previously from the browser history, type in 00000, hit enter, and right here you can see what comes back. We get our results array, but there's no results, and we have the status. The status says 0 results. And this is the kind of information that's really important to track down. We can use the status text value to determine whether or not the request was successful. If we pass in a real zip code like 19147, which is Philadelphia, we're going to get our results back. And down below, the status is going to get set equal to OK. We can use this to determine that things went well. Between the status property and the error object, which we have over inside of Atom, we can determine what exactly to do inside of the callback. The first thing we're going to do is add an if statement, checking if the error object exists. This is going to run the code inside of this code block if the error object exists. If it doesn't, fine. We'll move on to the next else if statement, which we'll write in just a moment. If there is an error, for the moment, all we're going to do is console.log a message to the screen. Something like unable to connect to Google servers. Perfect. This is going to let the user know that we were unable to connect to the user servers, not that something went wrong with their data like the address was invalid. This is what's going to be inside of the error object. Now the next thing that we're going to do is add an else if statement. And inside of the condition, we're going to check that status property. If the status property is 0 results, which it was for the zip code 00000, we want to do something other than trying to print the address. Right here, status equals 0 results. Inside of our conditional in Atom, we can check just that. If the body.status triple equals 0 underscore results. If that's the case, we're going to print a different message other than unable to connect to the Google servers. For this one, we can use console.log to print unable to find that address. This lets the user know that it wasn't a problem with the connection. We were just unable to find the address they provided, and they should try with something else. I'm going to add an an address to fix that typo. Perfect. Now we have error handling for those system errors like being unable to connect to the Google servers and for errors with the input. In this case, we're unable to find a location for that address. And this is fantastic. We have both of our errors handled. Now this body status property that shows up here, this is not going to be on every API. This is specific to the Google Geocode API. When you explore a new API, it's important to try out all sorts of data good data like a real address and bad data like an invalid zip code to see exactly what properties you can use to determine whether or not the request was successful or if it failed. In this case, if the status is 0 results, we know the request failed and we can act accordingly. Back inside of Atom, we can now go on to add our last else if clause, if things went well. And this is going to be your challenge for the video. I want you to add the else if clause, checking if the body status property equals okay. If it does, you can go ahead and run these 3 lines inside of the code block. If it doesn't, these lines shouldn't run because the code block is not going to execute. Then I want you to test things out over inside of the terminal. Try to fetch the address of 0000 and make sure that instead of the program crashing, you get our error message printing to the screen. Then you can go ahead and mess this URL up by removing some of the important characters. Try again and make sure this time you get unable to connect to the Google servers. And last but not least, see what happens when you enter a valid address. Make sure our 3 console log statements still execute. Take a moment, add that else clause, test things out, and when you're done, go ahead and click play. Hopefully that didn't cause you too much trouble. To get started, we're going to add that else if statement. And inside of the condition, we're going to check if body status is okay. Body dot status, checking if it equals, using triple equals, okay. If it is okay, then we're going to simply take these lines and move them right here. If it is okay, we're going to run those 3 console.log statements. I'm going to add a missing semicolon onto that last console.log. And now we have a request that handles errors really well. If anything goes wrong, we have a special message for it. And if things go right, we print exactly what the user expects, the address, the latitude, and the longitude. To test this over inside of the terminal, I'm going to start by rerunning the command with an address that's invalid. When I run this command, you can see that unable to find address prints to the screen, and that is fantastic. Instead of the program crashing, printing a bunch of errors, we simply have a little message printing to the screen. This is because the code here that tried to access those properties that didn't exist no longer runs because this condition gets caught and we simply print the message to the screen. Now I also want to test that the first message prints when it should. I'm going to delete the S and the dot from the URL, save the file, then I'm going to go ahead and rerun the previous command. This time around, you can see unable to connect to Google servers prints to the screen just like it should. Now I can test the final thing by first readjusting the URL to make it correct, and then fetching a valid address from the terminal. I'm going to use the app node app.js, setting address equal to 08822, which is a zip code in New Jersey. When I run this command, we do indeed get our formatted address for Flemington, New Jersey with the zip code and the state, and we have our latitude and longitude right here. This is fantastic. We now have a complete error handling model. To quickly recap what we did, we simply added else if statements inside of the callback. Callbacks are just one function. So in order to figure out if things went well or if things didn't go well, we have to use else if statements. This lets us do different things, like print different messages, depending on whether or not we perceive the request to have gone well. For example, when we make a request to Google providing an address that has problems, in this case there's 0 results, the error object is not going to get populated because it's not technically an error in terms of what request thinks an error is. It's actually in the response object, which is why we have to use body.status in order to check this error. In this case, we have a 0 results status. That is indeed an error, and we act accordingly. That is it for this one. We now have error handling in place. We handle system errors, Google server errors, and we have our success case. In the next video, we're going to be moving this into a separate file and abstracting a lot of the details. We'll talk about what that means and why it's important next, so stay tuned. I will see you then.